All right, I think we'll get going. So hello everyone. If you're tuning in for the first time tonight, welcome to Orchid Festival 2021 Wild Discoveries. If you tuned in last night, welcome back. Once again, many thanks to the Friends of the Bruce District Parks Association who, with the assistance of Parks Canada, have facilitated this event so that we can immerse ourselves in the beauty of the Bruce Peninsula and learn more about our role in preserving that beauty. We're here today on the traditional territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, comprised of two communities, Saugeen First Nation and the Chippewas of Nawash, who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. I encourage each and every one of you to educate yourselves further about the land you live on and suggest consulting nativeland.ca to learn more about the Indigenous territories, Indigenous languages, and the treaties of the place you call home. Last night we had two wonderful presentations. Brian Popolier's presentation on identifying orchid species on the Saugeen Bruce Peninsula, and Tyler Miller's presentation, Time Travel on an Alvar, A Plant's Perspective. Tonight, we'll be learning from Audrey Armstrong during her presentation on creating habitats for birds, bees, and butterflies, and Megan Bonifant's presentation during her presentation about the Nature Conservancy of Canada's acquisition of Vidal Bay on Manitoulin Island. If you have questions for the presenters during the presentation, I encourage you to ask them using the Q&A function that can be accessed at the bottom of the screen. Zach, one of our volunteers, will highlight questions to be answered live at the end of the presentation and will facilitate the live Q&A session again this evening. We will break for 5 minutes between presentations to allow the next presenter to set up. I think we're ready to begin. So our first presenter this evening is Audrey Armstrong. Audrey graduated from the Ontario College of Art and Design and Experimental Art and Textiles. For 10 years, she ran her own weaving business, Watercress Weavery. We are actually connected with Audrey because she is a presenter with the Monarch Teaching Network. Audrey has led in-depth workshops on monarch butterflies, habitat development, and voices from the land workshops, developing visual and literary interpretations of nature in Canada and the USA. She continues her love of teaching by leading workshops for Ontario Parks and Parks Canada staff. She is active in many community volunteer organizations, including the Owen Soundfield Naturalists and Huron Fringe Birding Festival. Recently becoming a mature naturalist with a special interest in habitat creation, Audrey shares her passion and concerns for the natural world with the public. Welcome, Audrey.
Hello.
Hello, we just need your video on as well, please, and thank you. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, and good evening to the audience, and thank you to the Friends of the Bruce District Parks Association, Parks Canada, Tony Edwards, Heather Keast, Jane Greenhouse, and Alex Gerben. You've all been very helpful in the planning stages. And sometimes listening to news about bird, bee, and butterfly population decline due to chemical impact, land development, and climate change, it just makes us feel helpless. Like, how can we as individuals help? Well, we can help by creating nature-friendly habitat in our own urban or rural backyards. We really can make a difference.
Audrey, if I may cut in, we aren't able to see your video at this time. Just in Zoom, if you wouldn't mind turning your video on, that's great. Your PowerPoint presentation looks perfect. There we go. Thank you so much.
Okay. That's great. So perhaps there is a silver lining here, just referencing the COVID-19 experience, in that we have been observing nature more, enjoying wildlife, and working in our gardens to find peace and comfort. And right now I can picture all of your lovely gardens. I think they're probably filled with pollinators, butterflies, beneficial insects, and birds. And in my talk tonight, I will talk about just some of the many possible habitat options for your gardens. I want to highlight this author. Some of you may know his writing, and I think most of you would enjoy this book, Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Tallamy. 2007. If you have a backyard, this book is for you. In it, he emphasizes the value of planting native species over introduced species to produce food for birds, bees, and butterflies. And his more recent book is Nature's Best Hope, 2019. In this one, he encourages homeowners everywhere to set aside half of their properties for native plants, creating conservation corridors that provide wildlife habitats. And, you know, we want to provide habitat for the wildlife. And of course, that's why we're here tonight and talking about it. But you also have to acknowledge that there's kind of a little personal satisfaction for us too. Obviously, we love looking out our windows and seeing the birds feeding on our berries and plants. So it's for us as well as for the good of mankind, wildlife kind. So to have birds, we'll start with birds. To have birds, you need to have insects. And when rearing their young, parent birds bring food to the nest many, many times a day. They need to forage close to the nest to feed their chicks. So they need lots of food concentrated in a relatively small area where the nests will fail. Studies of a warbler pair record the male and female carrying food to the nest 812 times a day. Just imagine the volume of caterpillars and bugs needed by birds rearing young in your neighborhood, well, hopefully in your backyard. 96% of North American bird species feed insects to their young. So where do they find all these insects? Douglas Tallamy tells us that native oaks are some of the very best trees you can plant in your yard for wildlife. Oaks can host over 500 caterpillar species and contribute to food webs. They're a keystone species because if you plant ornamental varieties that originated in Europe, Southern North America, or Asia, you won't provide food for those babies because those non-native species are not familiar food sources for our insects. And just remember, when people talk about garden pests, they're actually talking about the food needed for these baby birds. In summer, a robin's diet is earthworms, caterpillars, and beetles, but in the fall, their diet switches from worms to mostly fruit. So plant fruit trees. And why? It's not just for us, we love the fruit too, but also some birds like this Bohemian waxwing need fruit. And consider adding native cherries, plums, apples, and pears to your yards. Also native shrubs such as highbush cranberry, serviceberry, nannyberry, chokecherries, elderberry, and dogwood are all appreciated by birds. They'll provide food for birds throughout the fall and winter, as well as providing insect nectaring, pollination opportunities all through the blossoming seasons. And as for this little bluebird here, if you have the right habitat, you might have these little beauties nesting right in your backyard, and then you won't have to worry about mosquitoes. So you see how they will take care of us if we provide habitat for them. And birds love perennials too. Here's an example of the common evening primrose. It's a beautiful flower with spikes 5 feet tall or taller. It's native to our area, and it's a host plant for a yellow-pink specialist moth that's named, surprisingly, primrose moth, and it nectars and pollinates it. But all through the winter, it's just like a little redpoll and finch silo feeder all winter long. And birds love the seeds from many other native perennials too, such as false sunflower, Scotch thistle, coneflower, milkweed, and goldenrod. And they also use thistledown and milkweed floss as nesting materials. And hummingbirds are actually pollinators too, illustrating once more how nature is so interconnected. And ruby-throated hummingbirds love to nectar at zinnia, butterfly weed, cardinal flower, and bee balm. And they also feed on insects, providing some protein for their diet. To attract birds, you do need to have a water source, and it can be just this simple, a little bird bath. You have to fill it frequently, but if you live right on the water, as I know some of you do, you're all set anyway. So when you look at these two homes, which one would you want to call your home? And for wildlife, it's the same way. We just want to emphasize shrink the lawn. With all the amazing native plants, shrubs, and trees available, it's really easy to give up some lawn and rewild your yard. Just have to reduce the lawn bit by bit, year by year, naturalizing your yard and incorporating native plants. Manicured lawns are actually a desert for pollinators and most wildlife. The father of biodiversity, E.O. Wilson, calls them biological wastelands we call lawns. And who really enjoys mowing them anyway? So native pollinators are actually more than just bees. We often think about bees when we use that word pollinators, but you can see from this little poster that we have butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, beetles, flies, ants, wasps, and even mosquitoes that pollinate. Now, it is the native bees that do 70% of the pollination, and there are over 350 species of native bees in Southern Ontario. You know, we hear about the loss of honeybees, and they're not at risk of extinction. They're not native to Canada, and they were introduced from Europe 400 years ago. They're very important for agricultural pollination. But it's actually the native bees, the wasps, flies, and other native pollinators that work together, forming the network of biodiversity. Native bees emerge earlier in the spring than honeybees, and they're important pollinators of those early spring blossoms, the wildflowers and the shrubs. You may have read this National Geographic magazine last spring, May 2020, and it's shocking, the data in here, that 90% of flowering plant species and 75% of all crop species depend on pollination by insects. They're called the little things that run the world by E.O. Wilson. But a study in Germany showed a 3/4 drop in insect biomass between 89 and 2006. That's just 17 years with a 3/4 drop in insect biomass. So that's continuing on to this day, and it's creating a big problem for birds and for all of us. Insects are part of nearly every food chain. 1 out of every 3 bites of food we eat relies on pollination. Without pollination, we would lose food such as apples, blueberries, strawberries, melons, peaches, nuts, vegetables, and many, many others. Did I mention coffee? This pollinator crisis is making us more aware of our responsibility to insects. So let's look after them. And it's actually what good gardeners have been doing over the centuries. So specifically today, let's look at native orchids and their pollinators to celebrate the Orchid Festival. And of course, I know you all know not to move any wild orchids into your gardens, but you might have habitat where they naturally grow. And you might be stewards of property where they naturally grow. Just for your interest, this orchid poster is actually a free PDF download from 2014. And if you're interested in this and some of my other references, I will send you a resource package. I'll give you the connection at the end of my presentation. Many orchids trick insects into pollinating the flowers. The color and odor of some orchids is enticing, but there's often nothing to eat inside. Orchids must compete for pollinators, and this competitive aspect has been very successful since the family of orchids is one of the largest in the world. In the Northern Hemisphere, the climatic conditions found at a latitude of 45 degrees seems to suit orchid species. We're very lucky here on the soggy Bruce Peninsula because the cold bottom conditions and the calcareous factors combine to make both Bruce and Gray a botanical treasure house. Now, your speaker last night, Brian Popelier, gave a talk on orchids, an excellent talk. So I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I just have 4 of our local wild orchids and their special pollinators to talk about with you tonight. So Brian also showed us this beautiful Calopognon tuberosa, or sometimes called grass pink. And the flowers almost appear to be upside down, with the lip at the top of the flower and those yellow sort of lollipops that bumblebees mistake for pollen-filled anthers. I guess it must be quite comical. I've never witnessed this, but as the bees land on the imitation stamens, the hinge at the base of the lip drops them onto that large curving column that projects out below. The impact causes some pollen to be detached, with the bee carrying pollen off to another flower, and the process is repeated. And with this white bog orchid, sometimes called fragrant orchid due to the vanilla scented spires of blossoms, it may be visited by day from skippers or by night by owlet moths. And moths are particularly attracted to white and silvery and yellow flowers, since they do all their hard pollination in the evening and night hours. This blunt-leaved orchid, Brian also mentioned that it's pollinated by mosquitoes. And I found a really interesting reference by the great American botanist Carlisle Lure. And he wrote in his journal how mosquitoes hummed in swarms around this little orchid. And they carried so many bright yellow balls of pollen, the insects looked like they were wearing their own headlamps. I'd love to see that, but I can imagine how many mosquitoes must have been humming around that to give you that impression too. And the blunt leaf orchid apparently does reward them with a little bit of nectar at the tip of its tiny hollow spur. But the showy lady slipper orchid, which is visited by a wide range of tiny bees, is best pollinated by medium-sized bees. They're the only insects that are effective pollinators because they can actually go into this beautiful slipper and then escape the flower later with the pollen on their bodies. And the deceptive attraction of fragrance lures the insects in, but they leave without nectar. Now, I would like to thank the Orchid Festival for helping to promote the Owen Sound Field Naturalist publications. I expect that some of you watching tonight have a library full of these, but maybe you're new to botanizing and you haven't collected these books yet. All of these reference books are available by mail order through me. I'm the publications volunteer. This is the email you can connect with me from, and I'll have my personal email at the end of the presentation too. But I would like you to know that the Orchids of Bruce and Gray is almost sold out now. And at this point this summer, my husband, Willie Waterton, is working on photographing the Orchids of Bruce Gray for our 5th reprint with guidance from Parks Canada staff, Nature Conservancy personnel, and a few individuals. And I showed a few of his orchid photos just now. I would like to also draw your attention to the checklist of vascular plants for Gray and Bruce counties. And it is actually sold out. The hard copy is sold out. And we are having it updated by your excellent speaker. Your speaker, Tyler Miller, who talked about Alvars last night, is working on updating this publication for us. But because it's not available, and we know it's a very important document for botanists to have, we've made this available as a free download on our checklist, on our website, the website here. So you can go in and you can download that onto your phone, so you can have it for reference in the field, or you can print out a copy, whatever you like. But hopefully next year or so, we hope to have the hard revised copy again available. And Heather, I loved your recollection. You mentioned that when Nels Mahar used to carry his boxes of books around in the trunk of his vehicle, and he'd bring them to the Orchid Festival in the early years, and he'd bring them in and sell them to people. So you know, perhaps in the future, when we meet in person, I could be the one with the boxes in my car, bringing all these beautiful books to the Orchid Festival again. So this little chart shows what pollinators need. And so when planning your garden habitat, just keep these points in mind. You need areas of flowering plants with a diversity of native species and a continuous succession of blooming periods, spring to fall. I mean, that's the ideal, but we can't always do that. Most of all, what you need to provide are host plants so that insects can lay their eggs on. And you need to have areas where insects, nesting areas in which to lay their eggs. And I'm also expecting that most of you are free of pesticides in your gardens. It's very important also, though, to ensure that the plants that you use in your garden are free of neonicotinoids, because if you buy them from sort of grocery store type nurseries, you can't be absolutely sure. Some of them might have been grown by nurseries that don't adhere to the neonic restrictions. So to be safe, it's highly recommended to only buy from our local native nurseries, our nurseries that sell native plants. And I have that information in my reference package too. You also need a little bit of bare ground, some leaf litter and mulch for the insects to burrow and build their nests in. And some moths and butterflies pupate in leaf litter over winter. So they need a diverse array of landscape features such as rocks, deadwood, and dead stems. And in spring, just resist that urge to clean up too early and leave some leaves and twig piles in your areas. And I know gardeners often wonder, when can I start to tidy up my garden? And the guideline is generally just to wait until after some of the first wild flowers in the woodlands are in bloom, or until after spring temperatures reach 16 degrees Celsius on a regular basis. And then you can cut down your perennial stems, leave 12 to 15 inches of stubble as solitary bee nesting sites. My friend Patty Byers was describing one spring watching a Baltimore oriole pull strands, long strands of fibers from an old milkweed stalk. She left the stalks in her garden, and the oriole was pulling off those strands to use them to build her hanging nest. So you can see they still have a lot of value in the spring. Now, some people like to provide actual habitat structures such as these for bees. And this is a little bee nesting habitat. I have the instructions on how to make this little bee hotel that they're found on the David Suzuki website. And this close-up photo shows what Bill Moses, one of our Owen Sound Field Naturalists members, did. He used invasive Phragmites stems inside a plastic drainage O pipe as a bee hotel. And you should also have a puddling station for bees, butterflies, and you do obviously have to keep refilling that and cleaning it in the hot weather. Bloodroot is a woodland plant that flowers in the early spring, providing pollinators with that fuel that they need to reproduce. But during cold weather, or if there's low pollinator activity, it can actually self-pollinate. And ants help to disperse their seeds, spreading clumps of rhizomes, making it a great ground cover for a shady, naturalized area in your woodland garden. And this slide, this text is from a little book I'm going to reference to you shortly, but I'll read it. By planting a garden for pollinators, you will also be planting a garden for birds, because not only do birds eat the seeds and fruits that are the direct result of pollination, but they also consume vast quantities of insects, especially caterpillars, the same beneficial insects you are attracting to or increasing in your garden by creating pollinator habitat. And so it seems as a result of COVID, people are getting back to the garden. I think 2020 was called the year of the garden. And in your gardens, you'll want some annuals to get a quick fix for your pollinator gardens. These zinnias, cosmos, and sunflowers back behind will help to fill your garden with pollinators and birds. And if you have a vegetable garden, a good sized vegetable garden, you can just alternate the rows with flowers. And vegetables flower too, so just let the lettuce bolt and flower. And even rhubarb blossoms will also attract native pollinators. This bumblebee poster is from Wild Preservation Canada, and it illustrates 16 native species of bumblebees in Ontario. So up here on that little bluebell, you can see the common eastern Bombus impatiens, and you can thank it for pollinating your strawberry and tomato plants. But 4 of these species, 4 out of these 16 species, like the rusty-patched bumblebee, are rare and declining. So some fun facts: one bumblebee, a single bumblebee, can visit and help pollinate 3,000 flowers a day. Bees can see a color imperceptible to humans and known as bees purple. It's a combination of yellow and UV light. Bees prefer flowers that are pink, purple, or blue, and apparently they can't see reds. Just wanted to talk about some cool resources that you can have. For example, this book, did you know that there are all these various wild bees, sweat bees, solitary and communal bees, cavity nesting and ground nesting bees? Most native bees are solitary bees and are not aggressive, stinging only if trapped, slapped, or handled. And in this book by Heather Holm, Pollinators of Native Plants, has all this information and more. And it will even explain in detail just how the bloodroot self-pollinates. It is available through Pollination Guelph, along with this outdoor signage that you can also order and place in your garden. It's mainly for the educational value, especially for some of your neighbors and friends that might be admiring what you're doing in your yard. You can just point to this sign and that explains it all. Also, this little book, which references the now endangered rusty-patched bumblebee, its co-author, Sheila Kola, was the one who made the last known sighting of the rusty-patched bumblebee in Pinery Provincial Park, 2009. Since 2012, it has had the unfortunate distinction of being the first native endangered bee in Canada. But this little book is about much more than this single bee. It has a whole section on native plants that was written by Lorraine Johnson. She's also the author of the book 100 Easy to Grow Native Plants in Canada. And there's a lot of detailed notes on pollinator interactions and suitable growing conditions. The entire book is a free download from the Friends of the Earth website. And I just liked it so much. I actually printed out a copy, and you can either do that at home or take it into a print shop and print it out. I'd just like to make a note that some of the native plants, they're all native plants that are suggested here, but some of them are more suitable to the Toronto area than to Grey and Bruce. So that's why you need to have the checklist of vascular plants so that you can double check to make sure that you have native species for your part of the world. And then this is also available, this Trees for Bees poster. It's produced by the Friends of Earth. And I know, we know about spring blossoms, but there are so many trees that are host plants for butterflies, moths, bees, flies, and wasps. And some will host up to 300 to 500 species of butterflies and moths. When I mentioned that some of them are more suitable to super southern Ontario, for example, the eastern red bud is not native to Grey and Bruce. So I just want to talk a little bit about bees, but because there are so many, 350 in Southern Ontario, let's look at just 3 examples, and we'll look at their preferred nectaring plants. The tricolored bumblebee, which is native to our area. And this is a list of all the flowering plants that you might have in your gardens. And bumblebees are preferred pollinators of many orchids, as I mentioned. And the leafcutter bee is a really interesting one. You may have seen leaves that were cut by this bee. They glue the overlapping pieces of the leaf together with saliva, and they make sort of a little tube and nest cells for their eggs. And there's a long list of perennials that would attract this bee into your garden too. I'm sure that you have many of these, black-eyed Susans and Coreopsis and so on. The wool carder bee is a cute little bee that prefers fuzzy plants for nesting, such as lamb's ears, mullein, rose campion, and pussy toes or pearly everlasting. So now we'll move on to butterflies and moths. There are over 1,500 species of moths in Ontario. I should mention too, this poster is available from Canadian Wildlife Federation. And it highlights not just butterflies, but moths. And you know that they are the ones who are laying hundreds and hundreds of eggs, creating thousands and thousands of caterpillars, which are all valuable food sources for birds. So we'll look at just 3 examples of moths and their host plants and nectaring plants. And the details across the top, if you can see that there, are the host plants and then the nectar plants. But this beautiful giant silk moth Cecropia does not nectar because it lives only long enough to mate and lay eggs. It has no mouth parts since it never eats. And all we need to provide for these is their national tree, the sugar maple. So those are the host plants for the Cecropia moths, cherry, plum, apple, and so on. And I'm sure many of you have seen this hummingbird clearwing. At first glance, you look at it and you think it's a hummingbird, but it is actually a moth that hovers. And for host plants, it needs our viburnums to lay its eggs on. And that would be the high bush cranberry, the nannyberry, and the red osier dogwood. It has a proboscis for nectaring, and it loves to nectar at bee balm, phlox, and swamp milkweed. Now down here, we have the Isabella tiger moth. Have you always wondered who was the parent of the cute woolly bear caterpillar? As host plants, this moth just wants our native trees, birch, maple, and plants such as sunflowers and herbs and dandelions. It never nectars, living a brief life to mate and lay eggs. And just a little note here too that I'm sure you're aware of, since moths are nocturnal, they're flying and they're laying their eggs at night. So just make sure that your outdoor lights are not constantly on, and consider installing motion sensors if you have security lights that are on all the time. And try not to overdo solar lights in your gardens. Fireflies think that an outdoor light is a potential mate, and they waste a lot of time and energy on that little light instead of a more suitable mate. And a fun fact is that moths like white, yellow, and silvery flowers. So I expect you've seen some of these little signs in your neighborhood. Maybe some of you are part of the Butterfly Way David Suzuki initiative. It's a really effective educational program, and I'm seeing these popping up all over the place. So here's a perfect Butterfly Way meadow. And as Douglas Tallamy says, to have butterflies, we need to make butterflies. In other words, we have to provide them with host plants to lay eggs on. And goldenrod is a plant that is a keystone perennial. And despite what some people think, goldenrod does not aggravate hay fever. Ragweed is the culprit for that. But if you have meadowlands, you can fill them with goldenrod, asters, milkweeds, and fleabanes, which will then host thousands of species of insects. As well, these meadows provide precious nectar to help migrating monarchs build up their fat reserves for their trip south. So this chart is from my Friends in the Monarch Teacher Network, and it has highlights just 6 common Ontario butterflies. We have about 100 species of butterflies in Ontario, so we'll just talk about 6, or maybe I'll add in a few more. If you follow along the top, you can see the season for the butterfly in Canada, the picture of the caterpillar, the host plants, and the adult butterfly, and then the nectaring plants in this column. To me, the nectaring plants are just the easiest ones, maybe because we also live in such a beautiful natural area where there are so many wild flowers. But I think our real task is to provide host plants for insects. So here for the red admiral, the host plant Pellitoria nettle family. Well, I'm not suggesting that you plant stinging nettles in your garden. We have lots in our agricultural areas, and wood nettle is common in wetlands and woodlands. Monarchs I'll get to later. We have the painted lady that likes hollyhocks, thistles, plantain, and pearly everlasting. The eastern black swallowtail with the carrot family and the dills. And the cabbage white, I think that you all know this one. It loves the brassica family, including your precious kale. And the clouded sulfur that lays eggs on white clover. And fun facts, butterflies prefer to nectar at flowers that are red, orange, and yellow. And monarchs will nectar from many different plants. And I just want to talk with you a little bit about some of their favorite ones, because Asclepias syriaca used to be on a noxious weeds list, but it was removed in 2014. But just a little note, if you are a neighbor of some farmers who do crop farming, you might want to clip their seed pods so that they don't spread into the croplands. Another member of the milkweed family that we can grow here is the Asclepias tuberosa, and it's highly recommended. Some people say it's perfect for people with black thumbs, but I actually have had trouble growing this one. I think it's because it likes sandy soil, so it would be good for the Lake Huron shoreline. And my favorite milkweed plant to recommend is this one, the Asclepias incarnata, and it will grow as big as me. And you can see here that it's a caterpillar factory. And it's a very well-behaved perennial. I just suggest clipping the seed pods in the fall so you can plant them elsewhere or share them with others. And collecting seeds in the fall for rewilding is really the way to go. So if you have a large area or meadowlands that you want to plant, just go out and collect the wild native species that you want and plant them immediately. If you just think about how excellent Mother Nature is, that they fly around and are planted in the fall, buried by the snow. So common milkweed responds well to fall or winter planting, as we say. I just have a few slides to show you of a little pollinator garden that I created at the Friends of McGregor Point Provincial Park. And just want to tell you a story about how after we planted it, we had a success story, because the very first summer, this American painted lady butterfly visited the garden to our delight. And the thing is, we had the host plant there. We had the pearly everlasting. So the results are the eggs and then the caterpillars. And the staff took this opportunity for educational purposes to encase the plants with this cage and use the whole life cycle process for educational purposes. We later added these laser cutouts to shout out to visitors to come over and visit me. And that's just a simple puddling tray on an old stump. Just briefly talk about how we tag monarch butterflies in the fall for citizen science. And if some of the Bruce Peninsula Park staff were part of a training workshop I did last year, and it was really early in the season when we did this workshop, so we were actually practicing tagging on paper butterflies. But if some of you are interested in seeing how that process goes, I am holding a family-friendly workshop on August 21st for the Owen Sound Field Naturalists. And sometimes you might be lucky enough to see roostings of monarch butterflies, especially along the Lake Huron shoreline. Sadly, the numbers of monarchs are dropping drastically. And last year, this past winter, that is, the overwintering population occupied only, it's measured in hectares, it occupied 2.10 hectares, representing an estimated 105 million butterflies. That's representing a loss. And you can see how this graph is going gradually downhill. Sadly, there's been a decline in monarch populations because of the loss of habitat. And it's not just monarchs, of course, but it's also insects and birds that are impacted by all these threats. The loss of habitat and intensive agricultural practices, pesticides and herbicides impacting both residential and agricultural lands, and extreme climate change. Examples would be the tornado going through Barrie lately and the forest fires in British Columbia. Extreme weather events such as flooding, droughts, hurricanes, and fires are destroying so much of our natural habitat. But I do want to end on a positive note, because I said that we can help. And I think that really some of you are already creating habitat with your gardens. You're planting native species, which is helping the ecosystem. You're shrinking your lawn bit by bit. You're rewilding even a part of your property. And all of that is helping to make our planet more livable. And if you're stopping or at least reducing your use of chemicals, that's important. David Attenborough advocates that increasing biodiverse habitat for birds, bees, and butterflies will help to mitigate the climate crisis. So that's empowering. You can also help to educate within your own community with garden signage such as this. We can each do our part to help wildlife because we're all interconnected. But I want you to understand that I think this big picture is vital. We need to support and to help fund conservancies in their work to create corridors for wildlife, corridors of biodiversity, providing breeding habitat for songbirds, for bees, for butterflies, and other wildlife. So consider donating to groups such as Nature Conservancy of Canada, Bruce Trail Conservancy, Escarpment Biosphere Conservancy, and other local conservation areas. Conservationist Aldo Leopold once lamented that the oldest task in human history is to live on a piece of land without spoiling it. So let's see if we can turn that concern around and green up our properties and our world. And that way together we can make a big difference. I would just like to give a big thank you to the photographers and others who provided work with me for this presentation. They're listed here. And as well, I mentioned earlier, if you'd like my 3-page PDF resource package, if you could just make a note of this, and you can email me at this address and I will send it on to you. And I am looking forward to the next presenter, Megan Bonifant. But I want to say thanks very much for joining in tonight. And I think we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, we do. So reminder for everyone to put your questions in the Q&A section. I always forget how many different types of pollinators there are other than just like the few bees. It's just so many.
That's true.
So we don't have any questions yet. So if you have a question, go ahead, throw one in. It'll be answered right away.
Well, you know, I have a feeling that my mother had an expression, and it was, I think I'm preaching to the converted. So I have a feeling that the audience out there tonight is a very knowledgeable group, and you know, they might have some good suggestions too to pass on to the rest of the groups. Well, I felt I was going a little bit too fast there at one point, but I think some of you might have noticed that I did talk an awful lot about the monarch butterfly. That is one of my favorite pollinators to talk about, but there's a reason for that too, because the monarch is such an umbrella species and people know it so well. Children can recognize it at a glance. And I think, you know, when you're using that sort of as your little poster child for talking about creating habitat and creating conservation land for pollinators, it goes a long way just because it's easily identifiable. Sometimes all those tiny bees out there are absolutely amazing, but how many times do you actually get close up and get a good look at them?
And then just for a clarification, just to send an email to receive the presentation or is that the reference package, right?
Yeah, it's just a 3-page package. I have a bibliography and some website references and lists of some of our local nurseries for those who may be new to the area. Yeah, some different things that I'd be happy to share with you. I'll just send them all in a group email if you give me a quick request.
So it looks like your presentation was so well that no one had any questions. So
that's all right. Well, maybe everybody will have a chance to go and get themselves a little refreshment before the next presenter then.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk, Audrey. It's great. Oh, here we go. Our schools and churches planting pollinator gardens. Do you know that?
Yes, there are many examples of that. And it's such an excellent program to involve children in. I know when I was teaching, that was one of our focal points, and I'm happy to say that there are a lot of school gardens that are, you know, involving the children's planning and participation. So it is a really great example. And as a matter of fact, churches too. I know I mentioned Patty Byers. She has a pollinator garden. It's one of the Saugeen Shores pollinator pods in Port Elgin, and all it takes is a few volunteers to keep an eye on it, keeping it, you know, tidy and weeded, and also watered during the dry spells.
Okay, well, thanks, Audrey, for the presentation. It was great. And I think you said earlier that if anyone else has questions that they can't think of right now, you can also send it to that same email, right?
Right.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions afterwards, send them back to the same email, and we will be back at 8 o'clock for the next presentation.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, thanks again.